Here we are, chapter 16. We're going to be talking about pulmonary ventilation in chapter 16. And what pulmonary ventilation is really is how we get air into and out of our lungs. And we'll start talking about the concept of gas exchange, which is respiration. So when we say respiration, we are talking about gas exchange. When we say ventilation, we're talking about moving air into and out of the lungs. So chapter 16, ventilation, chapter 17, respiration. It's kind of broken down. So the respiratory system, main function, gas exchange. So we are exchanging oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide, which is a product of the Krebs cycle, right? And cellular metabolism, which is really cellular respiration. Cellular respiration, big concept this semester. So there's really four processes if we break down respiration. The first one is pulmonary ventilation. We say breathing, it's moving air into and out of the lungs. From where? From out in the atmosphere. From out in atmosphere. So we're bringing air into our lungs. That's pulmonary ventilation. And in the lungs, we're going to have external respiration. And why external? Because remember, respiration is gas exchange. And we are exchanging gases between the external environment, which is the air we brought in from the atmosphere, into our blood. So we're taking the oxygen out of the air and bringing that new oxygen into the blood and taking the carbon dioxide from the blood and moving it into the atmospheric, well, what will be the atmospheric air, and we are breathing out. That's external respiration. Now we have, and this is in the pulmonary circuit, now that we have external respiration, we have lots of oxygen to be transported and delivered in the blood to cells, tissues. Cells in the tissues are going to take that oxygen and dump off the carbon dioxide that was produced during cellular respiration. And that's what we call internal respiration. So this is internal gas exchange. And it's occurring between the cells and the blood. But it's still respiration, it's still gas exchange. So there's external respiration and internal respiration. So it looks like this. And this is just supposed to be, yay. Respiration truly involves the respiratory system and the circulatory system, because we have external gas exchange between atmospheric air and pulmonary capillaries. And then we have internal respiration, and that is between blood and really the interstitial fluid, which then exchanges with cells. So that's internal. So if we look down here, this is showing you pulmonary ventilation, moving air into and out of the lungs. So we can have external respiration between the alveoli, where that air was brought from the atmosphere into the alveoli. So there can be gas exchange between the air in the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. That's external respiration. Then that New oxygen is being transported to the cells. Carbon dioxide is being brought and put into the blood, getting transported. Systemic circuit, bringing oxygen. Pulmonary, back to the right side. So pulmonary circuit can get rid of that carbon dioxide and get new oxygen. We have internal respiration. That is the gas exchange between the systemic blood vessels, really capillaries, and the tissues. It's really not going straight to the tissues, though. Remember, we have interstitial fluid that's kind of the intermedium between the blood and the cells. So external respiration, we have pulmonary ventilation, we have exchange of gas, carbon dioxide and oxygen between the lungs and the blood, then we transport it throughout the body, and then we have internal respiration between the blood and the interstitial fluid and then the cells. All that so we can have cellular respiration. Why? Why do we need oxygen? Because this is the whole point of the respiratory system, to get oxygen to the cells. Why? Well, over and over again throughout the semester, oxygen is needed to accept the electrons coming out of the electron transport chain to make ATP efficiently, right? So whole point of the respiratory system and oxygen. Quick overview of the anatomy. We have the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. So the upper respiratory tract is all of this wonderful stuff. It's where we get that atmospheric air either through our nose or through our mouth, and we take it into the pharynx. From the pharynx, it will go down into the larynx. This is the epiglottis here, and when we're breathing, the epiglottis is open, so air can come down into the trachea. When we eat, of course, we have that epiglottis fold over the trachea so the food can go down the esophagus. Air's going to flow, and at this point, right below the larynx is where we say the lower respiratory tract, and this is the upper respiratory tract. So if you have a URI, that would be upper respiratory infection. Laryngitis, common cold where you have nasally speech. They're all upper respiratory infections. If you have a lower respiratory infection, now we're talking bronchitis or pneumonia, those kinds of things. Those are lower respiratory tract. Then we have the conducting portion. This is all bronchi, bronchioles that conduct air to the respiratory alveoli and just the alveoli. It's really respiratory bronchioles with alveoli. When we get there, this is the respiratory portion. Why? This is just conducting air. It's just bringing air, and it's atmospheric air to the alveoli and respiratory bronchioles. Why? So then we can respirate or exchange gases, right? Exchanging gases. That's going to occur only in the respiratory bronchioles and the alveoli. Conducting zone, trachea, and then it's going to branch into two primary bronchi. One goes to the left lung and one goes to the right lung. Once those primary bronchi go into the lungs, they're going to branch a second time And so these are the secondary bronchi. This is branches off a primary bronchi. And I always put primary as number one. There are 3 lobes on the right lung, so there's 3 secondary bronchi, 1 going to each lobe, 2 lobes on the left, so 2. Then off these bronchi, so here's the trachea. Here is the primary bronchi. And now it's showing you, so this is the left lung. Those are secondary bronchi. Everything, then the secondary bronchi is going to branch into a tertiary bronchi. So these are tertiary. There are going to be several tertiary bronchi off a secondary. And I was a little bit wrong there. So here's a tertiary, here's a tertiary. Everything then connected to that tertiary becomes a bronchopulmonary segment. That is its own little kind of unit. It's like having a heating system in a two-story house. Even more, better analogy. There's an apartment building. There's a lot of units in that apartment building. So the building itself's like the trachea. Then you walk in, and there might be a right side to the building and a left side to the building and a courtyard in the middle. So this would be the courtyard here. Then you walk through the hallway, and there might be 2 different sides to the left side of the building. Then you get to, so that would be the secondary. And then you get to the different apartment doors in that secondary building. And each one of those apartment doors is a bronchopulmonary segment. Each one of those bronchopulmonary segments or apartments has their own heating and air conditioning, where they're bringing in cool air, or they're bringing in air and they're cooling it down, or they're bringing in air and heating it up. In either case, that whole unit has its own control over that airflow. That is what a bronchopulmonary segment is. It's its own control of airflow through all the way from the tertiary bronchi to the alveolar lobes. So that's a bronchopulmonary segment. You can take out an entire bronchopulmonary segment. The rest of the lung bronchopulmonary segments are going to do their thing. So you can kind of section those off. Then the respiratory zone, that's the conducting zone up until those terminal bronchioles, tiny little ones. And then those terminal bronchioles are going to branch, like here, into the respiratory bronchioles. They're respiratory bronchioles because they have little alveolar kind of sacs attached to them, but they also have singular alveoli on them. And this is where oxygen can come in and carbon dioxide can leave. And this would be the pulmonary capillary. Just a little bit of anatomy review. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar is the ciliated cells, and goblet cells produce mucus. That's so we can trap pathogens in the mucus. And then the cilia on the pseudostratified, these little hairs on the pseudostratified ciliated columnar are going to, as you move air, you go, you're moving air and the mucus up just to keep those pathogen and debris away from the really delicate respiratory membrane of the alveoli and the pulmonary capillary. It also is going to increase air temperature of that air moving through your respiratory tract, and adds a little bit of water, humidifies it, which is helpful to our respiratory membrane. Respiratory zone is where we have respiration or gas exchange. and it's external respiration. Gases are going to diffuse via their own partial pressure gradient. So you have the partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and they're going to move from a high to a low, and we're going to talk about that in chapter 17. So this goes through the structures, and you can see air is in here. This is where atmospheric air goes, right? So air is flowing and it's going to here, and then the pulmonary capillaries are out here. And so there's going to be oxygen coming in and carbon dioxide leaving, and this is where gas exchange is occurring. So gas exchange is respiration. The cells of the alveoli, there's a couple different kinds. There's the endothelial layer. It's a single, simple squamous cell that makes up the alveoli. So these are simple squamous cells, very thin. And that is what's making up the alveolar structure. You can see that these are pulmonary capillaries here, right next to it. So this is where we're seeing the respiratory membrane. Here is where oxygen is coming in. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Here's the respiratory membrane, and that's not even it. Let's try this again, shall we? Respiratory membrane. You have oxygen in here. Oxygen is going to move in. You have carbon dioxide in here, and it's going to move this way. So across this respiratory membrane, oxygen here, going here to load up into the red blood cells in the pulmonary capillary. On the flip side, you have CO2 going this way, and it's going to then get blown out. Respiratory membrane is extremely thin. Why? So we can have quick diffusion of gases, because this little red blood cell is moving. And that red blood cell is moving because the blood is moving. And so that's supposed to be moving. So as this red blood cell is moving, oxygen has to quickly load onto the red blood cell as it moves through the pulmonary circuit. So respiratory membrane is very thin for quick gas diffusion. And what helps enable that respiratory membrane to stay thin is that these alveoli get blown up like a balloon. Air is in here, right? That's how we blow up balloons. You breathe air into there. And the air molecules that are coming in are pushing on the walls of the balloon to hold it out. Well, there is water in air. And so those water molecules are polar. And if you remember way back, we talk about polar molecules, they want to stick together. So if there's water in the air, then those water molecules are going to want to congregate together. And that is creating surface tension where the walls want to go this way. So it's going to it's kind of work against blowing it up like a balloon. And the reason you want it blown up like a balloon is you really want increased surface area, because if you have increased surface area, diffusion happens faster. SA is surface area. And we need diffusion to happen fast, right? Because we need to get that oxygen into the pulmonary capillary as that red blood cell's moving. And so these type 2 alveolar cells secrete a substance called surfactant. And surfactant breaks apart, those clicky water polar molecules that want to hang out together. So it breaks apart the water molecules So air can flow up alveoli for large surface area, quick diffusion. To respiratory membrane, this is the simple squamous. Those are the type 1 cells. The respiratory membrane is a simple squamous cell and an endothelial, which is also simple squamous. So really it's just two very thin cells. All right, mechanics of breathing. We need to use our muscles to breathe. Now, for just what we call resting or normal breathing, non-active breathing, we really only need to use our diaphragm. Our diaphragm is this dome-like muscle here. You can see the diaphragm. It's under here. And when we contract our diaphragm, we pull it down. So that diaphragm is going to flatten out. If we release the diaphragm, we stop contracting it, it just goes back up. So this would be contraction, and this is just relaxing muscle. If we want to have slightly more active breathing, then we start using our intercostals. So the external intercostals help pull the ribs out, the internal intercostals help push the ribs back down. Our lungs are surrounded by serous membranes in the that make up the pleural cavity. Those serous membranes, the inner membrane is the visceral pleura. This is actually attached to the lung tissue itself. So if we're looking at this right here is the visceral pleural membrane. And there's a little spacer cavity. So we have the pleural cavity in here. There's a little bit of serous fluid, just a tiny bit. And then on the outside here, we have the parietal pleural membrane. So there's these two membranes with a little bit of space in between that are creating the pleural cavity. Might get confusing. Pleural cavity being the big thing. We also say pleural cavity, or you can say pleural space here. This is going to come into play when we talk about pressures. And again, that's when we get into a little bit more of chapter 17. Right now, we're going to focus on how to bring air into the lungs or ventilation. And we do that by moving air in bulk. We just bring a bunch of air from the atmosphere into our body. And we call that bulk flow. What drives this bulk flow are pressure gradients, right? We talk about gradients and things move passively from a high, struggling here, folks, from a high to a low. So pressure gradient, like in the cardiovascular system, you're going to have a delta P, which is the difference in pressures from atmosphere to alveoli. And the direction of airflow is going to be determined whether the pressure is higher in the atmosphere than alveoli or lower in atmosphere than alveoli. This is what's going to move air. So there's two phases of ventilation. The first is inspiration. That's bringing air into from the atmosphere. And in order to bring air from the atmosphere into the alveoli, the pressure in the lungs has to be less than the pressure in the atmosphere, right? So it's going from a high to a low. Air is coming into the lungs. If we want air to leave our lungs, which is expiration or having air flow out of our lungs back into the atmosphere. So this expiration is airflow from alveoli back out into the atmosphere. Then the pressure in the lungs has to be greater than the pressure in the atmosphere, so air flows back out. So these pressure gradients are driven by basically the size of our thoracic cavity, which will affect the volume of the space in the lungs where air is residing. Atmospheric pressure doesn't change moment to moment. It's the air pressure in the atmosphere. Now, if you go up in an airplane or you go underwater or you just drive up the Conejo Grade, there's going to be a little change in atmospheric pressure. We'll get to why when we go up and down, we can have pressure in our ears. In our middle ear, we have an auditory tube that connects our nasopharynx, where we bring air in, to our middle ear. And so that's why pressure changes can affect how your middle ear feels. But for now, let's just talk about atmospheric pressure. At sea level, it's 760 millimeters of mercury, and this doesn't change moment to moment. So all other pressures are relative to atmospheric pressure. Relative means kind of dependent on, or um, not dependent on, but compared against, or in reference to. Then you have the pressure inside your alveoli. So this is the pressure of air in the alveoli, and this is the pressure gradient that drives ventilation. Essentially, what is the pressure in the alveoli with respect to atmospheric pressure? Is it higher than atmospheric pressure or is it lower than atmospheric pressure? Because we can vary this by increasing or decreasing our thoracic cage or rib cage, essentially. So we're going to talk about that. There is intrapleural pressure. This is the pressure inside the pleural cavity or space. This is the space between the visceral pleural membrane and the parietal pleural membrane. So the pleural cavity is between the visceral and parietal pleural membrane. And so if you're wondering, this space is what is the interpleural space. Here, it's between these two membranes. Then there's transpulmonary pressure. This is the pressure across the entire lung wall. So if we're looking at this diagram right here, atmospheric pressure is coming in. Atmospheric pressure is going all the way to the alveoli, and you're going to have intrapulmonary pressure, which essentially is intraalveolar pressure. Then you're going to have the pressure inside the pleural cavity or space, right? Because this would be the visceral membrane. And then this would be the parietal and then you have the um, pleural cavity here. And so the intrapleural pressure is pressure in the pleural cavity between the visceral pleural membrane here and the parietal pleural membrane here. Then you have transpulmonary pressure, which is the pressure across this wall here. We're going to focus on mainly atmospheric pressure versus intrapulmonary or intraalveolar pressure. And then we're going to talk about the interpleural pressure because as you can see, atmospheric pressure and interpleural pressure go back and forth, varying 1 to 2 millimeters of mercury. But interpleural pressure, it has this negative. It's not a negative pressure. It is just less than atmosphere. Which also can be less than alveolar pressure. It's 4 millimeters of mercury less than. So remember, it's just a lower pressure. It's not a negative pressure. Respiratory pressures are always described relative to atmospheric pressure because atmospheric pressure is stable unless you move up in altitude, which that pressure is going to drop, but it's still going to be stable once you're there or underneath the ocean once it gets greater. So atmospheric pressure, stable, and so we can manipulate intraalveolar pressure to be higher than or lower than atmospheric pressure. So these just go through that. Atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters mercury at sea level. As you go up in altitude, the pressure actually drops. If you go underwater, then atmospheric pressure is actually increasing. Higher pressure underwater. That's why your ears hurt. You go underwater. Intraalveolar pressure, also known as pulmonary pressure, it's the pressure of the gas in the alveoli, and it's going to be relative to atmospheric pressure, and this is what drives ventilation or movement of air from outside into alveoli and vice versa, going the opposite way. So during inspiration, the pressure in the alveoli gets to be less than atmospheric. So atmospheric pressure is going to be the high because this pressure is low, air is going to flow this way. During expiration, uh, alveolar pressure is going to be higher than atmospheric pressure, and so air is going to flow out into the atmosphere. So this is really what drives ventilation, the difference between atmospheric and alveolar pressure. Intrapulmonary or interpleural pressure. If we're looking at the pressure here, it's going to be 756 millimeters of mercury compared to 760. So it's 4 millimeters of mercury less. Now, having less pressure pulls the visceral pleural membrane and the parietal pleural membrane together. It forms a vacuum. And so it's keeping these two membranes together. Think about it. Everyone's seen those plastic bags that you can put clothes or something in, and then you use a vacuum to suck some of the pressure out. And so originally your clothes in the bag looked like this, and then you use a vacuum um, to suck air out. You're basically creating a negative pressure inside. And it's not a negative pressure, you're just taking some of the pressure out. And so what happens when you do that is it takes the air out and it pulls the bag walls together. And so now your clothes are nice and flat. That negative or less pressure, or the pressure that you pulled out, is what pulls the bag walls towards one another. And that is why it's important to maintain less pressure in this interpleural cavity or space, or pleural sac, whatever you want to call it. It keeps the membranes together so it's moving as a unit. So as the muscles of the chest wall pull the rib cage this way, it's going to then pull the lung tissue with it. When the lung tissue elastic recoils because your muscles are relaxing, it's then going to pull the ribs back in with the lungs. This is why we can get the lungs to expand when the ribs expand. And then when the lungs recoil, because they're elastic, it pulls the ribs back with it. If for some reason the pressure inside the pleural sac equilibrates with atmospheric pressure, like a punctured lung, then atmospheric air comes in, and now it's the same pressure as atmospheric pressure, and we don't have that vacuum anymore. And so when the person goes to breathe, they pull their chest wall out, but the elastic recoil of the ribs, or sorry, of the lungs goes in. And so the lungs collapse inward, even though the chest wall is going out. That's when you get a chest tube put in and you suck air out. So it ends up pulling those two membranes back together. So why is it a negative pressure? It's not. It's just negative because it's less pressure than atmosphere. Right? Um, and this goes through what I just explained. Elastic recoil of the lungs is going to bring the ribs back with it. So as the lungs recoil inward and the chest wall pulls out, we need negative pressure to keep those two membranes wanting to be sucked together. Transpulmonary pressure, this is the distending pressure across the lung wall. As you have an increasing distending pressure, it's going to cause the alveoli to expand or increase their volume. It's just the difference between the inside and outside of the lung. Transpulmonary pressure can also be described as alveolar pressure minus interpleural pressure. This is a pneumothorax or punctured lung. So pneumothorax is a punctured lung. It can actually come from the inside. There could be a hole or an outside. So this is showing you that the parietal pleural membrane got a hole in it. Now atmospheric air is going to come in, and instead of this being 756, it's now the same, right? So now you have 760 and 760, 760, and we don't have this kind of pull towards one another anymore. And so remember, the lungs elastic, And so it's going to snap back. There's nothing to keep it with the chest wall anymore. So the chest wall can expand, the lung's still going to be collapsed. This is when you have to put in a chest tube, what they call a chest tube. I guess you don't go that far in. So if you're putting in a chest tube, you put a tube in here and you pull air out to kind of reestablish less pressure. So you're pulling kind of pressure out. So we now have that surface tension again that will keep the visceral pleural membrane moving with the parietal membrane. So lungs collapse, it can be due to plugged bronchioles, it can be due to a wound from the outside, it can be due to erosion of the visceral membrane due to disease. So you can see that in diseases as well. Anything that equilibrates the air inside the pleural cavity with atmospheric air is going to separate the visceral pleural membrane, and the elastic recoil of the lungs is going to take over instead of it staying with the chest wall. All right, so last concept is mechanics of breathing. And like cardiac output, we have the same formula, which is airflow is a, a movement of air, a volume of air moving, and it's the difference in pressure, in this case between atmosphere and intraalveolar, divided by the resistance to that airflow. So like cardiac output, if you remember, cardiac output is blood flow. And it had the same delta P over R, but this is the pressure difference between the aorta and the vena cava. We call that the mean arterial pressure. And you have total peripheral resistance. Same thing, instead of it being in the arterioles. So arterioles for cardiac blood flow, it's the resistance in the bronchioles versus the difference in pressure, not between the aorta and the vena cava, but between atmospheric pressure and alveolar pressure. Same concept though, right? That's what's driving air to move. Like cardiac output, what's driving blood to move from the left aorta all the way back to the vena cava is a pressure difference, and that pressure difference is our blood pressure, our mean arterial pressure. In airflow, it's basically the pressure gradient created by kind of manipulating the volume of your thoracic cage or rib cage. Atmospheric pressure remains constant unless you're going up into the sky or up in altitude or down in altitude. What we can change, though, is the volume of our thoracic cavity. So alveolar pressure changes is carried out by the muscles that control, that's a C, our thoracic cavity, basically our chest cavity. And there's something called Boyle's law. And Boyle's law says that the pressure of a gas is inversely related to the volume of the container of which gas is in. So we can change the volume of the container of which gas is in. We cannot change atmospheric pressure. Humans cannot change this. Unless we go up in altitude, and then we're not changing it. It's just we're going up in altitude and the pressure is less. The air pressure, gas pressure is less. Resistance to airflow is controlled by the radius or diameter of the bronchioles and whether there's a lot of mucus or a little mucus inside that bronchiole. So pulmonary ventilation, that's bringing air in and having air leave our lungs. And it's a mechanical process driven by muscles. And these muscles are manipulating the volume of the container containing that air gas. So it's changing the volume of our thoracic cavity, of which our lungs are inside. And remember, the lungs move with the ribs because of that intrapleural pressure being less than atmosphere. So as the volume changes, the pressure is going to change. And as the pressure changes, gas are going to flow until they're in equilibrium. And so Boyle's law is explaining this because explaining that volume changes can manipulate pressure changes. Technically, Boyle's law is gases will always fill their container. They're going to go from a, a higher pressure, smaller container setup to a larger container because they can spread out and those gas molecules can be farther apart. And if they're farther apart, there's less pressure. They're not bumping into each other. And so there is an inverse relationship between the volume of the container of gas and the pressure of that gas that is inside the container. Meaning, if pressure goes up, well, I should do it backwards. I shouldn't, well, I'm going to explain it physiologically. That is to say, if the volume increases, then the pressure is going to decrease. If the volume decreases, then the pressure is going to increase so they can stay equal. So inverse means if one goes up, the other goes down. So Boyle's law explains the relationship between the pressure of the gas in a container. And this is kind of showing you this is container 1. And that's equal to volume 1. Gas molecules have a nice big distance. And so it has pretty low pressure because those gas molecules are pretty far apart. If we make that container smaller, now we're forcing these gas molecules to be closer together. And that is going to increase the pressure because those gas molecules are bumping up against each other. And that is what pressure is. So this is this inverse relationship. Now, as the lungs expand and get bigger, the alveolar volume is going to increase, right? There's more space. It started out a volume like this. And as we contract the diaphragm, the volume has now increased. So that is here. As the volume increases, those gas molecules can separate and the pressure drops. And in this case, the pressure is dropping. The pressure is going to drop to be 1 millimeter of mercury less than atmospheric pressure. So now there's a pressure gradient between the atmosphere and intraalveolar because we expanded our ribs. Well, we contracted our diaphragm and or expanded our ribs, making the volume bigger, which made the pressure in the alveoli less. And so air is going to flow in until it's equal between atmosphere and alveoli. Between atmospheric pressure and alveolar. If we compress the ribs, right? This is inhalation. For exhalation, we relax the diaphragm. And so now we've decreased the volume. And if we're also using our internal intercostal muscles, it's pushing in. That's this. And now we have increased the pressure in the alveoli to be 1 millimeter mercury above atmosphere. So air is going to flow from the higher alveolar pressure to the lower atmospheric pressure, and air flows out. So breathing mechanics are this. Inspiratory muscles, this is bringing air in. We are going to increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. Main muscle is the diaphragm. Diaphragm contracts, and that increases volume of thoracic cavity, which decreases the pressure in the alveolar to be less than atmospheric pressure. So air flows into alveoli until it's equal. If we want active breathing, then we can use the external intercostals. They pull the ribs out, and it can even expand the thoracic cavity to be wider and the diaphragms up. So now we've really created an expanded. If we want air to flow out, we decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity. So it goes from this to this, and now the volume has decreased. We're using the internal intercostals, which push in, and then the diaphragm has come back up. The diaphragm up, intercostals in. We can also use accessory muscles like the abdominals, and we're basically creating a situation where the pressure in the alveoli is high. It's going to be higher than atmospheric pressure, so air flows out of alveoli. Remember, it's going from a high to a low. So this just goes through, you need to kind of pause, go through the sequence of events. It's showing you the changes, and then it's showing you what it looks like volume-wise. That's for inspiration. And so again, the mechanics of breathing, it's now adding in what's happening with the pressures. So this is where you stop the recording and read these steps. Adding in the neural component, we have motor neurons. We have respiratory centers in the pons and medulla oblongata, basically your brainstem. And these are really driving the rate and depth of muscle contraction. And that is going to basically change pressures. So we end up with alveoli being lower than atmosphere. So air flows in. If we're looking at this graph-wise, we start off at 0, alveoli If the diaphragm contracts, there's going to be a pressure change where alveoli is 1 millimeter mercury less than, less than atmospheric pressure. So air flows into alveoli. So this is the volume of air coming in as the pressure drops, right? Transpulmonary pressure, again, is between the alveoli where air is coming in and the interpleural cavity or pleural cavity. Remember, pleural cavity is always 4 millimeters of mercury less than alveoli and atmospheric. So it's going from -4, 4 less to -5, 5 less because this dropped 1. Expiration, again, this is where you pause and you read through the steps. So when inspiratory muscles stop contracting or you're actively using your internal intercostals, it's going to decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity, which increases um, alveolar pressure to be greater than the pressure in the atmosphere. So, whoops. So air flows from alveoli out into the atmosphere till they're equal. So we're trying to decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity to increase alveolar pressure. Basically, we are manipulating the volume of our thoracic cavity, and that is going to drive pressure changes to make air flow. Again, read through these. Here's a great time to stop, read the steps. In expiration, we're trying to decrease thoracic cavity volume to increase alveolar pressure. In normal tidal breathing, it goes above atmosphere or atmospheric pressure by 1 millimeter of mercury. And so air is going to flow out. So if we're looking at this graph, we're going above 1. But if you notice, I should have put the arrow the other way. If we're looking at the volume of air, it's going to decrease here. So when we do quiet breathing, we're moving about 500 mLs per breath, 500 mLs of air. So factors that affect pulmonary ventilation, lung compliance, how elastic it is, and then airway resistance. This has to do with the diameter of the bronchioles. Lung compliance is a measurement of the change in lung volume that occurs with a change in transpulmonary pressure. It's normally high. Why? Because lungs are elastic. They want to snap back. They can expand, but then they want to come back to normal. So they're like a rubber band. And then alveolar surface tension, thanks to the surfactant, water doesn't congregate and air blows up alveoli, so large surface area for gas exchange. What can decrease this? Well, if you have fibrosis or scarring of the lung tissue, then it's not going to be elastic. It's not going to expand. It's not going to contract. You can have a reduction in the amount of surfactant, which increases the surface tension and decreases surface area for diffusion. If you have a decrease in flexibility of the thoracic cage, scoliosis, some kind of structural issue, um, deformed thorax, ossification, paralysis, these are all things that can affect lung compliance. Um, if they become less elastic, they're less compliant. So they don't move out and in very well. That's going to cause a problem because you're not going to have pressure differences between the air in the alveoli and the air in the atmosphere. Surface tension, this is if you have a decrease in surfactant, and it can also bring the walls of the alveolar in, so you can have like a collapse or a resistance. It's it's going to basically be greater tension, less compliant. So this goes into alveolar surface tension and surfactant, and I had talked about this earlier. It's a detergent that kind of breaks up water molecules and so it can increase lung compliance, makes it easier for you have a nice blown up surface area for gas exchange. Type 2 alveolar cells produce surfactant. Surfactant reduces the cohesive forces between the water molecules because they're polar, and therefore it decreases surface tension in the lungs, which increase compliance. That's a good thing. Airway resistance, that's where the diameter of the bronchioles can be affected. Um, there's a lot of them, so they keep overall resistance low. But if there's any increase in resistance, it's going to, so if there's an increase in resistance here, it will decrease airflow unless, let me write this out so it makes sense to you. It will decrease airflow unless you can increase delta P. So you will have to make this even more negative or less than atmosphere to keep airflow the same. Same if resistance goes up. So that's why if you see someone that's that they're having an asthmatic attack or anaphylaxis shock, something that constricts the bronchioles. When you constrict the bronchioles, you're increasing resistance. And that increased resistance means you have to work harder to decrease the pressure in the alveoli, which means you have to really move your thoracic cavity out. Those rib cage has to go out. You've got to push the diaphragm down and use the abdominal cavity. So you kind of lean back and expand the abdominal cavity so it's even lower, so the diaphragm can go lower. So you can just really increase the volume of your thoracic cavity. And then on the reverse, you're really bending over and kind of trying to collapse your rib cage as much in as you can because you're really trying to change this delta P to offset the increase in resistance. So any pressure changes above normal to move the same amount of air, you're going to have to work harder. So airway resistance, same as with blood flow, the smaller the diameter. So if you have a bronchiole that's this big and that bronchiole gets constricted down, there's less room, so less space for air to flow. And that is going to increase the friction, which is basically an increase in resistance to flow. So that's gonna bring down That's going to bring down airflow. Um, as resistance goes up, flow, gas flow is going down. So things that affect resistance, they're passive forces. Um, these moment to moment, not really an issue. The main issue is the smooth muscle of the conducting portion of the respiratory tract, right? So bronchi and bronchioles. Then how much mucus secretion? If you have a lot of inflammation, you're going to have a lot of mucus. It's going to cause increase in mucus would basically increase resistance, right? So if airflow is the pressure difference between atmospheric and alveoli, and this is resistance, if this goes up, either that has to go up, and if that doesn't go up, then airflow goes down. Resistance is usually insignificant because we have our bronchos dilated as needed. You know, they're controlled by the autonomic nervous system. In the bigger primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, that's plural for bronchus. The resistance is meh, but when you get into the bronchioles, there's so many of them that these really kind of there's so many that they are the main contributing forces to resistance. And so the smooth muscle of the bronchioles, if it constricts, which is bronchoconstriction, the smooth muscle is going to contract and it's going to, I'll do it in red so you can see it, decrease the radius, which is going to increase the resistance to airflow. And if you're increasing the resistance to flow, you're going to decrease flow. If you make the diameter bigger, smooth muscle relaxes, diameter is bigger, radius is just half the diameter. You're decreasing resistance. There's going to be less resistance to airflow, so airflow goes up. Increases, decreases. So smooth muscle controlled by the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system bronchodilates or relaxes, parasympathetic bronchoconstricts. This is why epinephrine is a sympathetic, adrenergic. Why am I spelling so oddly? Activates your adrenergic system. That's right. If someone's having an asthma attack or anaphylactic shock, they're allergic to something and they're having trouble breathing, it's because they're bronchoconstricting. You give them epinephrine, causes bronchodilation, also causes an increase in heart rate and increase in blood pressure because it's sympathetic activator. So external control of bronchial radius, we have hormones that control this. Neurohormones like epinephrine, or just not activating the smooth muscle for bronchodilation. There's local factors. Histamines can bronchoconstrict, so that's why we take antihistamines to bronchodilate or stop the constriction. Right, so we have histamines released during asthma or allergic reactions. Also, if there is pneumonia, or anything that increases mucus secretion in the bronchioles, right? So if you have a bronchiole, but you got a bunch of mucus, You've now decreased the diameter to airflow. And this is increasing resistance, right? Carbon dioxide, an increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is going to increase bronchodilation. So more air can flow into alveoli, right? To increase oxygen delivery. Asthma, it's going to increase resistance in the airways. You can also have mucus secretion and inflammation with asthma. All those things are going to increase resistance. COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, this is where you can lose the elasticity, so you have less compliance. So compliance goes down, and it makes it harder for the lungs to collapse back after breathing. Asthma, you're going to have wheezing, you're going to hear the constriction, and so you're going to hear the air have that friction, and that creates this wheezing. Active inflammation is going to also, when it says bronchospasms, that's a bronchoconstriction, right? And that's increasing resistance. Airway inflammation due to immune response, to something like a cytokine storm that we saw in COVID, right? Anything that's going to thicken the membrane or cause bronchospasms, it's all increasing resistance, and that decreases flow, and that becomes a problem. And so pulmonary tests, our pulmonary function tests, they're looking at airflow, and this is what we're going to be doing in the lab. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it because we exhaust this in lab, but basically this is looking at air volumes. And so this is normal, what's called tidal breathing. Normal tidal breathing is just contracting your diaphragm and then relaxing it. And we get about 500 mLs in normal tidal breathing. So this is a normal breath. If you want to see what your capacity for bringing air into the lungs, like how much air, what's your max airflow? You take the biggest deep breath in above what you normally do with a quiet breath, and that's your inspiratory reserve volume. If you see what's your max air expiration, how much air can you blow out? That's your expiratory reserve. That's where you just try to maximally breathe as much air out as possible. And if you look at all those together, your just regular breathing plus how much you can inhale and how much you can exhale, that's called your vital capacity. Other factors is your functional residual capacity, which is just looking at how much you can expire, and then your reserve volume, or what's sometimes called dead space, residual volume. This is air that is not available for gas exchange, or what we call respiration, right? So residual volume is not gas that is being exchanged. And so if we just look at total lung capacity, it does factor in, because this air is still in your respiratory tract. It's just not at the this reserve or residual volume, sorry, is in the total lung capacity, but it's not your vital capacity. Vital capacity is how much air can you get to the alveolar for gas exchange, or respiratory bronchioles and alveolar for gas exchange. Total lung capacity has your residual volume that you cannot use for gas exchange. So this is going through tidal volume, It's generally around 5 mLs per single unforced breath. If you're using your muscles to make your thoracic cavity as big as possible, this is roughly an average inspiratory reserve volume. It's the volume you can still inspire or bring in after a normal breath. Expiratory reserve is after you have a normal relaxation of diaphragm, but how much more can you collapse down that thoracic cavity, decrease that volume so more air leaves your alveolar? It's about 1,000 mLs. And then the residual volume is just the volume that is in the respiratory tract, but is not available for gas exchange. Inspiratory capacity, how much you can bring in. Vital capacity, how much you can bring in and how much you can exhale. This is the amount of air you have to work with for gas exchange or respiration. Residual volume remaining, but you can't use for gas exchange. Total lung capacity, you bring in that residual volume. Obstructive pulmonary disease, you have an increase in airway resistance. And so you're going to have a higher residual volume. Uh, Functional residual capacity is going to go up. This kind of forces vital capacity to go down. And so because of this, um, this right here gets bigger. And so you have less of a vital capacity. This is like COPD, asthma, other factors. This just goes into COPD factors. You can go through this. This is really a good one to take a pause, maybe pause this and go through how emphysema, chronic bronchitis could be due to asthma, chronic asthma, how they can affect airway obstruction, how they can affect ventilation or gas exchange. We're going to use pulmonary function tests to look at total lung capacity and vital capacity. We're going to guesstimate residual volume, but we will be able to use our machines to find tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, and expiratory reserve volume. And then the second lab is going to be looking at FEV1. FEV1 is the percentage of the vital capacity that can be exhaled in 1 second. So it's a flow rate. It's seeing how quickly you can force a certain volume out in 1 second. And an FEV1 that's less than 80% of the air you have available to force out is an indication of obstructive pulmonary disease. Restrictive as well, but if you look at this, a low FEV indicates restrictive pulmonary disease. So we're looking at 1 second. How much air can you expire in 1 second? A normal person is going to have 80% expired in 1 second. If there's obstructive or restrictive, it's much lower, right? So we're looking at 40%. Then to kind of figure out the difference between restrictive and obstructive is if you keep going, obstructive, you're going to very slowly be able to force that air out. It's just going to take a long time. Restrictive means you can't get the air out because there's something restricting it. So these are a little bit different. This is more of the asthma and COPD. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in lab. Minute ventilation is kind of like the respiratory's version of cardiac output, right? Because cardiac output is a volume of blood pumped per minute. Minute ventilation is a volume of air in and out in 1 minute. And so it's going to be equal to how much air, amount air per breath multiplied by how many breaths are taken in 1 minute. So like cardiac output, it's 1 minute. And instead of stroke volume, it's tidal volume. So instead of the amount of blood being pumped out of the ventricle, it's the amount of air being moved per breath. So most people breathe about 12 times per minute. The average tidal volume is 500 mLs. And so if we're looking at this, it's basically 500 mLs times 12 breaths per minute. And this is mLs per breath. And so you can cross out breaths and you're getting 6,000 mLs of air flow per minute. But if you look at, you got to take out the residual volume because we're not using that for actual gas exchange. And so if we want to look at the volume of air reaching the respiratory bronchioles or the alveolar for actual gas exchange, we have to take out that residual volume. And so we have to take out that volume. And if you looked, the residual volume was about 150 mLs per 12 breaths. So this is going to be the minute ventilation right here from that page, right? So we have minute ventilation. We're just moving it here, but we're taking out the air per breath that we can't use. Not available for respiration or gas exchange. And mainly the alveoli, but respiratory bronchioles. And so that's normal ventilation. Oh, this is normal, and that's alveolar. So really, instead of 6,000 mLs per minute, humans on average have 4,200 mLs of air per minute to gas exchange or respirate. This is going to be, remember this 42, because preview, when we get into this, here's where we're going to start the lecture next time. So that's a little preview.